Welcome to Vesalius, the art and science of Renaissance anatomy. This is being brought to you by the Boston Medical Library, and I'm Dr. Dale McGee, a member of the board of the Boston Medical Library. The library has been functioning since 1875, when Dr. James Reed Chadwick, a gynecologist in Boston, felt that establishing the library would be an important way to make books accessible to practicing physicians. Our first librarian was Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes. Over the years, the library has evolved to have a large and priceless collection of antique medical books, including hundreds of incunabula, which are books that were printed before 1500. The library also contributes to the Center for the History of Medicine at Coutway and sponsors presentations such as this lecture. This evening's speaker is Dr. Richard Ratzan, an internist and emergency medicine physician who's been active in medical humanities for 40 years. He's published widely, both in literature and in medicine, and he comes from a medical family of doctors and nurses. He graduated from Trinity College in Hartford as a classics major. He has also been interested in the nexus between medicine, anatomy, and the arts, leading to his idea for the book, Imagining Vesalius. Dr. Ratzan lives and works in Hartford, Connecticut, with his wife of 52 years, Susan Ratzan, a pediatric endocrinologist. Their daughter, Catherine Peeler, is a pediatric intensivist at Boston Children's Hospital and is carrying on the family medical tradition. Welcome, Dr. Ratzan. We look forward to your presentation.
Good evening. My name is Richard Ratzan, and I'm a physician in West Hartford at the University of Connecticut Health Center and also Hartford Hospital. And I'd like to thank Dale McGee and my daughter, Katie Ratzan, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, honor, privilege, and treat to talk to you today about Vesalius, the art and science of Renaissance anatomy. If I might, I just would like to dedicate this talk to a good friend, Larry Schneiderman, who I met 40 years ago when I hosted a literature and medicine conference. Larry was a very talented physician and writer, published novelist, and died during the preparation of the book, which prompted my getting into this subject, which I'll go over at the end, called Imagining Vesalius. And Larry does have a nice prose piece in there. So what I'd like to accomplish today is to review very briefly the history of anatomical studies up to Vesalius and some of his contemporaries. Then to go over his biographical and career trajectory and information. Then spend some time on his magisterial anatomical text, land breaking, both in terms of anatomy and in methodology and in art. De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which the first edition was 1543. Then I would like to, one of my other dear physician writer friends, Bill Ober, a pathologist, always told me that a good writer writes to assignment and a good speaker should speak to assignment. So my assignment is to talk about Vesalius as a Renaissance anatomist, and then I will do that. And just close with a few examples of the book, which got me interested in Vesalius, which was published about 3-4 months ago by the University of California Press. This is Vesalius. This is the portrait at the very beginning of his Fabrica. It's an authentic portrait. It was one he liked. It was in the second edition of 1555 as well. And I have the URLs at the lower left. My email is at the very, very end of this talk. Anyone is welcome to email me for any questions or comments after this. And I will be happy to give you any links. And some of the links, I don't expect people to, these are mainly for attribution, but if anybody wants a link, I'll give it to you. And for some of the ones I think are more important, I tell you how to find it with a simple Google search field. Aristotle was probably one of the first important anatomists, felt there were several forms of matter that provide self-nourishment to the body. And he introduced a very influential concept, which is the theological structure and formation of the body. It was useful in some respects in terms of divining function, but its influence lasted way too long, 2,000 years, in fact. And unfortunately, some people took teleology to mean that you didn't need to know what the structure was. You just had to figure out why it was in the body at all. And it hindered some anatomical progress in O'Malley's view. The references at the end will show you O'Malley. It's Charles D. O'Malley, who wrote this phenomenal gold standard text about Vesalius's life and his career. It's really, there's no subject too small for O'Malley to have researched. It's really phenomenal. And if you like reading about history, whether you care about anatomy or not, and you like reading a well-researched book, get this 1964 book. Herophilus and Erasistratus were Alexandrian anatomists. Herophilus was more of an anatomist, and Erasistratus more of a physiologist. They did have the benefit of human dissection. Some of the subsequent anatomists did not, and had to rely on animals, which of course is a problem if you try to extrapolate that to humans, which unfortunately Galen did with major sin. I'm just starting a stopwatch here for myself. They were the last Antiquity anatomists to have human subjects. Hippocrates was more clinical medicine. Galen did not have the benefit of using human cadavers. He used primarily the Barbary ape. He was a prolific polymath and really a very learned man. He was called the Prince of Medicine, Prince of Anatomists. He was in the time of Marcus Aurelius and actually was his physician during the plague. But unfortunately, he extrapolated his findings on dogs and Barbary apes to humans with a proposed physiology that led him astray many, many times. More unfortunately, his influence was unquestioned, unchecked, and taken as gospel for centuries, up until Vesalius, in fact. People felt that whatever Galen said had to be correct. He wrote in Greek. They were translated extensively by the Arabic world into Arabic. Western Europe, until the time of the Renaissance, mainly had Galen in the form of Latin translations, which of course can always make an error compounded. He believed in certain things that were based on models, and which somehow I missed a slide, and which Vesalius corrected. Vesalius respected Galen quite a bit and was not out to embarrass his memory, which was not to the viewpoint of several of his critics after the Fabric came out, unfortunately. This is a wonderful, wonderful exhibit, which is being put on by Katie's brother and my oldest son, and his institution, which is ISAW, ISAW. I'm not trying to give anybody a plug here. It just went up. I don't know why these switch like that. It just went up last week, and it's a marvelous exhibit, online exhibit at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. So you can just Google ISAW and Galen, and you'll find it. Moving into the medieval times, Mondino da Luzzi was an Italian anatomist who, and you have to understand that the sections up until Vesalius took place with the professor up on a cathedra. You know, it's Latin word for chair, like a high bar stool, very high up. And he would read Galen, and then someone else, like a barber, would do the dissection. And it had nothing to do with what Vesalius viewed as a correct technique, and which we do as well, which is hands-on personal observation and reporting what you see, not what Galen said you're supposed to be seeing. He, unfortunately, as did most of the other anatomists on this page, reported, despite doing human dissections, like Guy de Chauliac in Montpellier and Berengario de Carpi, who was a very talented dissectionist, still viewed everything with a Galenic lens. Berengario da Carpi was the first to describe the anastomosis of the portal vein and several other organs. And this was essentially for the ossicles of the ear. If you're into ENT, many of the people on these pages took part in describing the ear and inner ear. Charles Estienne was an erudite polymath from a publishing family who did not really contribute a lot to anatomical knowledge, but is a prominent name. And there'll be some slides of some of these people so you can compare their anatomical illustrations with the ones that will follow of Vesalius. So this is the work of Estienne, and it's very cartoonish. And you know, the labeling is when you see the labeling of Vesalius, you understand how unhelpful this technique is. This looks more like something like William Blake than an anatomy text, but it's by De Carpi, 1535. So that would make it 8 years before Vesalius's Fabrica came out. They're roughly contemporaries. He's a little older. Vesalius's dates are 1514 to 1564. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, was a very famous Renaissance man who, among many other interests, studied the human body, and unfortunately did not publish his studies. Some people think that Vesalius knew about him and his work, but there's no evidence to that effect. Sylvius was a major figure in the 16th century anatomical world, and in general, and in Vesalius's world in particular. He came to medicine late in life, was at the University of Paris, which is where Vesalius was for 2 years, and was a very popular, a great teacher, was a very talented anatomist and dissector, but for some reason, it was just, he couldn't overcome. He never got off the Galenic hobby horse, and unfortunately became a vicious critic of Vesalius's Fabrica and Vesalius himself, even though Vesalius liked Sylvius and complimented him in his text as he did other anatomical figures. But he remained really a very ferocious critic of Vesalius's treatment of Galen, which was respectful. It's just that when Galen was wrong, Vesalius said so. Massa was another Italian anatomist who described the CSF, and then Vesalius and some of his contemporaries. Falloppio, of course, discovered fallopian tubes, which Vesalius somehow overlooked in his Fabrica. Falloppio was very respectful of Vesalius's errors and appreciated the foundation he had laid for himself and other students of anatomy. Bartolomeo Eustachi obviously discovered the Eustachian tube, was a critic of Vesalius as well. And Valverde de Musco, I only put in here because he borrowed a lot from Vesalius, but had a very famous image that people often think belonged to Vesalius, but it didn't. So here's Leonardo, of course. It's hard to look at anything by Leonardo without becoming incredibly humbled. This upside down mirror writing. And here's Eustachi. Again, you'll see the difference between these and Vesalius's images very soon. And here's that famous picture of a flayed. This figure, I didn't put on a slide. I apologize, I meant to, but not this particular figure, but this type of figure in the anatomical literature is called écorché, which means skinned in French, and all of the muscle men are écorchés. Okay, Vesalius was born, as I said, in Brussels, actually in Wesel, a town in the northwest, still on the map in the northwestern Germany. and it was near the Netherlands, of course, and it was part of the Hanseatic League earlier. He's part of a very prominent medical family, 4 generations of physicians. His great-great-grandfather, Peter, studied Avicenna, and all these people published, except Everard. Everard did, but we'll get to Everard. We'll get to Andreas in a second. Johannes was the most illustrious of all these people until Vesalius. He's a great-grandfather. He taught at the medical school that Vesalius went to, Louvain, and was a physician, as was Vesalius, to the emperor at the time. He was a physician to Emperor Frederick III, and was an independent thinker that Jaffe, another reference at the end, feels was an important influence on Vesalius, the tradition of being an independent thinker. He was a physician at Emperor Frederick III, and it was during his lifetime that the emperor bestowed on him the heraldic insignia of 3 weasels, which you'll see from in a couple of slides, and it's very prominently displayed on the frontispiece of the Fabrica, and it comes from the ancestral town of Wesel. Everard was the son of Johannes and the grandfather of Vesalius, also studied at the same medical school. His son was Andreas, an illegitimate son, which did not have the stigma it did necessarily later in other countries. He was legitimized by proclamation by the Emperor Charles V, to whom he was the apothecary, and his son Vesalius became the physician to Emperor Charles V only 10 years later, 12 years later. After going to a school in Brussels, Vesalius went to Louvain, getting a Bachelor of Arts. He then went to the University of Paris Medical School for 2 out of 3 years. He should have been there a 3rd year, but when war broke out between France and the Low Countries, since he was from the Low Countries, he was worried about his personal safety, and he went to Louvain and got his licentiate degree in medicine, and then went to Padua as a professor, where he was very, very popular, as evidenced by the frequent increases in his salary that O'Malley documents. In 1538, he published a large format anatomical atlas that was very popular, hugely plagiarized. This is how popular it was, with only 6 tables, very large format, but it was obviously the predecessor to the Fabrica, which he worked on from 1539 to 1542, and which was published in 1543 in Basel, Switzerland. In 1546, he became physician in the Imperial Court of Charles V, and I'm not going to go over his later years. He apparently, this story is very strange. No one to this day really understands the whole story or what it was, but he was alleged to have done an autopsy on a prominent Spaniard, and when he opened up the chest, the heart was still beating. The family accused him of vivisection and reported him to the Inquisition, which wanted to punish him, but through the intercession of Charles V, he was allowed to take atone and expiate his error with a ship, with a journey to Jerusalem and Mount Sinai. He never made it. The ship was wrecked, and he died on this Greek island of Zante, where he's buried. And it's not clear why he died, whether he was sick or what happened. Here are the 3, the heraldic device of the 3 weasels, and this is from the very top of the frontispiece, which you'll see more of later. And here are people looking down on the theater. Before I forget, I'll just mention it now. These were all woodcuts, which means it was black and white. These colored plates you see, the ones that are colored, were commissioned to be hand-colored and colorized by the owners, most of whom were physicians. and postgraduate students, not or medical students, but probably mainly physicians. And they were hand colored because, of course, the woodblocks would have been black and white. And you can also see these books are very often very heavily annotated. There's a reference at the back I'll point out to you, which is a phenomenal book by three Vesalian scholars, one of whom is the Jaffe I mentioned, and Daniel Margosi, who's at Cambridge, was very, very helpful to me in my book, and I thank him for that. But in their book, the three of them, they have a census of all where all the known copies of the Fabrica went around the world over the centuries, and annotated the annotations, what people wrote in the margins, because these were working textbooks for physicians. This is theater that's still around, where he taught in Padua. It's the Palazzo Bo, and Bo is short for ox, because it's on the street of oxen. It was just nicknamed Bo. The Fabrica arose out of Vesalius's desire to teach. He was primarily a dedicated, devoted teacher, and he felt that the best way to learn anatomy was by what we would now call in-person dissection, but realizing not everybody can have access to a human cadaver or a dissection, and there are only so many people who can fit around one. He decided to put the knowledge of the human body and the description of how to do these dissections, the technique, into his book. So it really was a pedagogic instrument. And as O'Malley says, it was the embodied proof of this new gospel of anatomical investigation, which is basically the scientific method where nothing's taken for granted, no bias goes into the observation, and you report what you find, and then you try and analyze what that means. The sections that were done to prepare the images in the Fabrica were probably done with his students, advanced students, and O'Malley called such group work research seminars, since Vesalius viewed his co-dissector medical students as collaborators. The sections, some were public as mandated by his contract with Padua, and some were private. He had a very good relationship with the Judge Contarini in Padua, the criminal judge, and he would notify the judge when he thought it would be the best time to execute the person who was supposed to be executed in a timely way for his dissection, which of course were favored in the winter. He really was a very fervent observer and dissectionist. He sometimes kept parts of bodies in his room for 2 weeks to study them. Most of these were criminals, and therefore most of the bodies in the Fabrica are men. There are a few women. You'll see a couple of images of some. Inside the book is a dedication to Emperor Charles V, and not as fulsome as they sometimes can be, these dedications. There's a portrait of Vesalius, which you already saw, the very, very famous frontispiece over which a great deal of ink has been spilled over the centuries in analyzing it. And then books 1 through 7, and it's called The Fabric of the Human Body in 7 books. That's a full title. And book 1 is osteology, which he thought was the most fundamental and important organ system of the body. And then the very, very famous muscle men images that people know about. Then the vascular system, the nervous system. 5 is a combination of various organ systems, GI, GU, and breast. And 6 is neck, the glands therein, like the thyroid and the heart. And then 7 is the brain. And I have sample pictures of each book to show you what they look like. So here's the frontispiece. Again, colored, and there's the device, the weasel device up on top. And you'll see a poem that goes with this from the Ekphrastic collection I put together. And this, by the way, is a woman which was not lost on anybody who studied his frontispiece. And there's Vesalius employing the technique he championed, which was firsthand, bedside, tableside dissection, not up on some cathedra, lecturing and reading from Galen. The text was in Neo-Latin. I just want to say a word about that. Neo-Latin was a Latin that evolved from classical Latin and medieval Latin. It was taught to any educated person in school, and it was used as a lingua franca all over Europe. So people in Hungary could read the Fabrica, as could people in Spain. It was Neo-Latin, and it was preserved for the most part because of Christianity, and then it became Neo-Latin, which was around for 400 or 500 years. It says 1900. That's a mistake. That probably should be 1800, I think. But lots of people wrote in Neo-Latin. John Milton wrote poems in Neo-Latin, and so did Sam Johnson. It was around for a long time, and these people are some of the Neo-Latin. I was a classics major, and I've read my share of Neo-Latin. Some of it is very, very good, and some of it isn't. But they wrote everything in Neo-Latin. It was better for textbooks, but theologians, everybody wrote in philosophers. Everything was in Neo-Latin. The construction of the book artistically was wood blocks of pear wood, cut parallel to the grain, which usually makes it harder to work with. So it was treated first with warm linseed oil. The woodcutter works based on a sketch, and the woodcutter was not necessarily the same person. The cutter was not necessarily the same person who did the sketch. And the woodcutter cuts away from the wood the parts that will appear blank on the page, and what's left, the raised parts, are inked and produce the lines and hatching. There's been a great deal of controversy and many pages on who the artists were. Probably from the studio of Titian, who was nearby. Almost certainly one artist, Calcar, was involved because he was involved earlier with Vesalius' earlier publications, and probably Domenico Campagnola, known for his drawing of landscapes. They worked well with metal types, since you could then print text and image together on the same page. And Vesalius went to Basel. He wanted nothing but the best for this book. He thought the best printer around was Johannes Operinus, as did a lot of other people, who was a very accomplished publisher and also a classicist prior to becoming a publisher. And it was printed in 1543. The original woodblocks were around until World War II. It's pretty amazing. Allowing people to study them. There's a reference at the back about 3 Vesalian essays, and they studied the original blocks, which unfortunately were destroyed during the war, World War II, by Allied bombing. And a lot of the information is from my book by a wonderful scholar, classicist, and ancient historian, a medievalist, Sachiko Kusakawa in Cambridge. Just a word about the historiated capitals, which you're going to see. They are historiated in the sense that they carry a little story. They form the initial uppercase letter of a word beginning of a paragraph or a page. They were common in medieval illuminated manuscripts. It's not new with Vesalius. What was different about his were that the uniform presence of these mischievous putti and comic, often macabre nature, telling a little story. And there were a set number of these letters, and they always had the same scene for the same letter. And here are some from a website. There's a lot of information about Vesalius. The I, a resurrectionist is more of a modern term. That means someone who is a grave robber. The letter I was always that, and the O are medical putti, putting a skull into boiling water. to cook away remaining soft tissue, the better to study it. And the Q, which you'll see very soon, are medical putti vivisecting a pig. So there's the Q. And just to show you, again, the really beautiful coloring job that people had done. And again, the annotations by the owner. These annotations could be criticisms. They could be poems. It's really quite fascinating. If you want to see, the best place to see the online digitized Fabrica is at the University of Basel. And you don't have to try to get this URL down. Just Google UB Basel and Andreas or Vesalius, and the home page gives you a title view, content, page view. If you click on page view, you can then watch each page at a time, enlarge it, the digitized version, zoom in, zoom out. At the bottom, if you click on it, there's a little menu with 3 dots here. You can then get a spread of 20 pages in a row or thereabouts, and you can click 1 page at a time or a group of 20 at a time. And it's really fun. And along the side is another menu, which you can then print a page, or you can download the entire book, by the way, or you can download individual image that you like, which is how I made a lot of the slides in this book, this talk. Well, these, for example, are all from that website, and they were downloaded 1 image at a time, and very high quality. This is an example you see in book 1. There's anticubital. So this is the elbow. By the way, I didn't put it in the talk, but this was a very, very fertile time for medical nomenclature. Prior to this, there were parallel terms for the same structure or organ or bone. You'd have an Arabic one, a Hebrew one, a Latin one, a Greek one. And so a lot of the nomenclature that we all know arose during the 16th century. Fallopian tube, Eustachian. Here's 2 of the very famous muscle men. Again, oceans of ink have been expended. I guess you don't expend oceans, but poured onto this image. It's very suggestive. And these backgrounds, by the way, people have worked out where these where these are, because a lot of the muscle men had the countryside in back of them. But you wonder whether this poor skeleton now has to dig his own grave or her own grave. And this is another very famous one, as you might expect, with the Shakespearean Hamlet overtones. And here is a very famous expression from the Fabrica: intellect lives on, all the rest is mortal, perishes. This is an example of what you might see in book 3, the vascular system. This is the portal system right here. And this is a image of the 30 nerves, which a poet friend of mine wrote a very humorous poem for our book, Jessica Greenbaum. And here's an example of book 5. And this is a woman, as you can see, not many of them. But you can see how the organs are, the mesentery has been stripped away, and it's a very detailed, helpful depiction of what he wishes to show. And this is a heart from book 6. And this is one of many, many pictures like this of the brain in the last book. And as you can see, the labeling was very precise. So if you look up EEE and go over here, you find out it represents, I can't read it from here, but in other words, these were meant to be instructive and helpful in identifying anatomical parts. So that would be one of the innovations, but to go over some of the innovative aspects and the legacy of the Fabrica, the most important one is the scientific method. And as O'Malley puts it, it was a movement in anatomical studies away from authority of man directly towards nature. And there was no privilege of Galen or privileging philosophy or religion. It is what you see is what you report. And Vesalius was very observant and recognized that only with hands-on dissection could the truth of the matter be reached. And then Jaffe quotes a 19th century Egyptologist that they must find it difficult, those who have taken authority as the truth rather than truth as the authority. That's essentially what Vesalius's project was, which was to make truth the authority and not Galen or anybody else for that matter. And he was incredible. The more I read about Vesalius, the more impressed I am about what an amazing observer he was. He had seen enough human bodies that he could tell when there was an anomaly. For example, a oarsman of the papal trireme who had an anomalous anatomy of the biliary tract, and therefore he never put into his Fabrica based on just an observation of one, an N of one. He paved way for future anatomists like Falloppio and Eustachy. It makes me wonder whether Vesalius was from Missouri, where I trained in medicine a few years ago, the Show Me State. And he insisted, even with illustrations sometimes, on parallel and sometimes simultaneous animal dissections to demonstrate the differences between animals and humans. And as O'Malley puts it, it makes him the first comparative anatomist. Another of the innovations that Vesalius brought to anatomy was the illustration and presentation of the material with quality images, the larger the better. He made the labeling of the image with texts corresponding to each other, the norm for the industry standard for anatomical texts. And they have very characteristic, you can always tell Vesalius, you didn't know who did that illustration, just their gestures, their sense of motion, very, very characteristic. And he consciously used classical models at times with statuesque appearance. We'll get to that just a little bit later. His fascial contributions were phenomenal in righting the wrongs that Galen had imposed on students of anatomy for centuries. Galen thought that the liver had 5 lobes. He believed in this rete mirabile, this porous network between the brain and the rest of the body through which the vital spirit passed, although he had never seen one because it doesn't exist in man. And he believed that there's one of the bile ducts emptied directly into the stomach, and thought that the mandible was constructed of 2 bones instead of being a single bone, all of which Vesalius corrected. But even so, Vesalius made some of his own errors, which he admitted later and revised in the 2nd edition. And Vesalius was very crucial in establishing books as more than just pictures, coffee table picture books, but with his labeling of the text and his describing the actual technique of dissection for others to look at, and for artists. He mentioned he also had artists in mind, so that their depictions of anatomy would be correct. It was very influential. To get to the Renaissance aspect of Vesalius, most people would agree there was such. I'll go over some of the aspects of what I think make the Renaissance, and then subsequent to these slides, go over how Vesalius fit in this picture. Most agree that there was a period from the 14th to 17th century. Some people don't think so, but we're going to assume for this talk that there was something called the Renaissance, which emphasized classical antiquity, emphasis on humans, rational exploration of the world around them, It may not be anyone else's definition, but I'm constantly reminded that it was embedded, at least in Western Europe, where it occurred, in Christianity, and it was a time of tension and transition. To go over these individually, the emphasis on the best aspects of classical antiquity. There was a great return to classical mythology, to the classical literature, people like Galen, people like Aristotle, and particularly Aristotle. And this was a time when it was understood that humans were an appropriate and proper subject of study, and gave rise to what's called humanism, which is that study of humans and what makes us human and the world that we live in. It was also a time that led to a tension with the Christianity aspect of rational exploration. Cassira wrote a wonderful essay on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the Fabrica, in other words, in 1943, in which he described the Renaissance as being characterized by a positive skepticism, more of an analytical type of attitude, stance, and more empirical than previous centuries. Unfortunately, such skepticism and new thinking requires your willingness to face orthodoxy, and the opposition to orthodoxy will confront you with, as in Galileo and his notion of a heliocentric universe in the Catholic Church coming down on him. Cassira calls these people bold, and Jaffe talks about courage, but it's easy to forget how, and Vesalius faced this in spades when he tackled Galen, but it's just part of what a rational person has to endure in his discoveries, her discoveries. And since it was a time embedded in Christianity, it created this curious but understandable, strange bed partners of rational exploration and new technologies and discoveries with Orthodox Christianity. But the Orthodox Christians very often felt very comfortable coexisting. And I'll show you two examples of religious people who embraced Vesalian anatomy and incorporated it into their faith. But it's also a time of tension and cross-fertilization that I think for most people would be exciting, but sometimes has some consequences. This is a poem, and over here, if you just go to the NLM, put NLM and Vesalius into Google, you can see this. It is a poem that's written by Philip Melanchthon, who was the kind of second in command to Martin Luther, the great expositor of Lutheranism, more than Luther himself sometimes is said. It's handwritten in his own hand, and it was found in a copy of the Fabrica, which is at the National Library of Medicine. And the reason I put this here is a translation I did for our book, but it says, "Not by mindless chance did atoms come to this world, and its shaper." So then it talks about the first 8 lines. I happen to think this is a double sonnet, which is a stretch, but it is 28 lines, and there's a nice break at line 15. So he compares the shaper of the world and the universe to the shaper and of the body, and you know, it's the same God that made the universe. Jacob Balde was a Jesuit priest who wrote tons of poetry, some of it very good and some of it very compact and dense and opaque, in my opinion. But he does the same thing in his poem that I translated with Tony McCrow, from Professor Emeritus from Trinity. He says God created the world. Again, it says that there's no random error, no atoms. This was an attack on the atomistic view of the world. There was no random chance that the world came to being. Likewise, look at your hands. You think there was no architect of the human body? mankind's construction. So there was this curious adaptation of anatomical, mathematical, physical discoveries to faith. So looking at Vesalius as someone who ended this description of Renaissance, he certainly did rely and emphasize classical antiquity. Galen and Aristotle are cited frequently, and his statuesque poses for the muscle men, including one that looks just like the Belvedere torso, which I'll describe in a minute, certainly were inherited from his appreciation of the art and literature of antiquity, like other people in the Renaissance. And there's a reference at the end by Harcourt, who talks about the statuesque imagery in the Fabrica and how it looks very much, some of these images, like fragmentary sculptures that are remnant from antiquity. In terms of humanism, the Fabrica is the epitome of what it is to be a human from the inside out, literally. Her anatomy, her relationship to the world around us, human apparatus like a desk or a shovel, with gestures. It's a very, very human look at humans. In terms of rational explanation of the world, you've already gone over how he epitomized the scientific method and the freedom of the need for a freedom of anatomical study from unquestioned authority. And here's the Belvedere statue, and you can see that this illustration here is clearly modeled on this statue, which was discovered in Rome and then moved to the Vatican in the Fabrica, and then moved into the Belvedere court. You can see it says Pius VI. So this is still in the Vatican, and it's called a Belvedere torso. But you can see how Vesalius leaned on classical sculpture. In terms of embedded in a Christian background, Vesalius, like others, like those poems I showed before, believed that his not religiously, but he went out of his way many times, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, to point out that God created the body, and that his anatomical discoveries are just revealing God's work. And in terms of the Renaissance being a time of tension and change, Vesalius initially was very much a Galenist, but was willing to change and became more and more confident using his eyes. And in terms of fertilization, Jaffe makes a point that Gemma Frisius, whom he mentions in the Fabrica, his friend, sorry for the typos, and was a very talented mathematician and cartographer, and with Mercator in the 16th century revolutionized map making. He may have influenced Vesalius's labeling schema with his own technique of labeling his maps with grids. And in terms of rational explanation of the world, I don't think we need to emphasize again that that's what he did. Here is the page 1 of book 1, and it talks about how the bone is the hardest of all the parts of the body, and that the Opifex, the creator God, formed it from this, formed the bones to be of this temperament. And so you see that he's referring to God. This Opifex means a maker. So he credits God with making the bones and the body, just as Melanchthon and Jacob Balde did. Here's his friend Gemma Frisius, who didn't just maybe influence his labeling of body parts, but also is mentioned specifically in a long description in the Fabrica about helping Vesalius to get down a criminal executed on a scaffold, a gibbet. And these were often left on the gibbets or places of execution until their bones rotted and the birds picked them clean as a deterrent to people that this is what happens if you commit a crime around here. So but they were often not in such great shape. And actually when he went to get the humerus, it came apart. Just to finish up, Jaffe is very good at describing the multifactorial milieu of the Renaissance that nurtured Vesalius and his studies. He grew up in a family that was traditionally medical. And had a medical library, some of the books of which were written by his family in a tradition of intellectual studies and independent thinking. He had some like-minded contemporaries and colleagues at Louvain, like Frisius. The development of the printing press certainly was important. And the migration of Greek scholars is important to know about. They migrated to Western Europe, people who could read Greek after the decline of Christian Byzantium and the rise of the Turkish Empire, leading to reading Galen in the original, not through Latin translations. And it led to a resurgence of interest in Galen and unfortunately his influence. The Reformation and with the Lutherans' emphasis on salvation by faith alone and individual interpretation of the Bible was a corollary of his independent interpretation of the body. And the rise of humanism as a legitimate study in many contemporary disciplines probably had an influence on him as well. The reason I got into the Vesalius as a subject that I found interesting was a idea I had at the end of 2017 to take some of the images that you've seen, some of those muscle men pictures and the brain pictures, the hand pictures, and ask poets, physicians, nurses, painters, sculptors, people I knew, people I didn't know, some medical, some not, poets, professors of English, a neurosurgeon. I asked 50 or 60, actually I asked a lot more than that, but I wound up with 50 or 60 people saying yes, to construct a ekphrastic volume celebrating Vesalius. And ekphrasis is the literary depiction of an image, the verbal representation of an image. And I don't need to go into that now, but it originally came from my background as a classics major and the ekphrasis in both Homer and Virgil about the shields that they are describing, which were artworks. So here is the frontispiece, and I'm not much more. I'm not going to read to you or for you, but he took this frontispiece and put it into a poem. He's a very well-known poet and a diagnostic nuclear radiologist. Wynne Morrison is a pediatric intensivist and palliative care physician in Philadelphia and wrote about these hands. Unfortunately, the only examples I decided to show you can fit on one page, with one exception, but there's also another wonderful poem by Kelly White about hands. This is by someone probably many of you know, personally, and it's Rafael Campo, who's a poet and an internist in Boston, and his memories of being a medical student and seeing this image. It's a very moving poem. And that is the last page of the Fabrica. So, and here are the references. This is the statuesque basis of some of the images. This is the Neo-Latin, more Neo-Latin. These are the 3 Vesalian essays that were based on the original blocks. It was written post in 52, but I'm pretty sure they had access to the original blocks. And Morley Latin, this is that wonderful census. This is the same Jaffe as this Jaffe, which is a biography with writes very, very well. O'Malley is the biography I told you about. Catherine Park is a wonderful look at a feminist look at anatomical dissection. The book that I told you about, and then another study about Vesalius. And any questions or comments now or in the future, please feel free to email me, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Rich, for an excellent presentation. You gave us a lot of depth on Vesalius, the man, the book, the times, and the context. And I really appreciate you doing this presentation for us. We have several questions here, and I'd like to pose them to you and get your answers. One has to do with what was the official Catholic Church's position on dissection, and were there times when that position made it harder or easier for disseminating information?
There was a permissive attitude. I hate to use this example, but it's almost like don't ask, don't tell. They knew what was going on. The dissection came back, human dissection came to be more frequent and definitely legitimate. The grave robbing was something the Catholic Church didn't particularly like. No one liked it, frankly. But the Catholic Church knew that dissection was gaining ground in the 15th century, whereas for hundreds of years before that, it was not. And they permitted it. Vesalius never, and all during the 16th century, Falloppio, Colombo, Silvius, all these people I mentioned, Eustachy, Valverde was really more of a plagiarist than a dissectionist. I read of no instances where either the law or the church came down on a dissector, and the dissection was not only legitimate, it was part of the curriculum of the medical schools. But they were really limited to criminals. But of course, as I said, the grave robbing went on, and I think the church knew about it. But again, I don't remember any. That picture that you saw, part of that story is that he went in there and he had to stay in there all night because they closed the gates of the city at night. And I think it was at Montfaucon. And so he stayed there all night so he wouldn't get caught. And so it was secretive when they were grave robbing, but the sections as part of the curriculum of medical school were often public. So the Catholic Church knew about this, and I read of no instances where the church or the law came down on legitimate dissections.
Okay. And Shannon Perry asks, I've seen anatomical models at the University of Bologna. Did any of the men you spoke of make these models?
Oh, I don't know what models you're talking about. Are they're like sculpture or wax or wood? If you're talking about that, no, I don't know. I didn't read anything about models at Bologna, so I don't know what material they were made of or what era they're from. But all the dissection studies I talked about were print media. That's a fascinating question. As my daughter told me, if I got a question I couldn't answer, I should say, boy, that's a fascinating question. I'll get back to you.
Okay. Do you think Vesalius had an influence on Michelangelo?
I don't think so. I have not read anything about the interaction in terms of influence between the two. I don't know that much about Michelangelo, but I don't think so.
Okay. And given that this was a long time before there was surgery as we know it, was a routine part of the practice, of medicine. Do you think there was a practical value of dissection in anatomical atlases in Vesalius's time?
Yeah, I mean, that's I know speakers always say this. That's a great question, but actually, it's a very good question. I didn't bring this out in my talk, but one of the influences of the anatomical dissections was to help people not only understand the body and overthrow galenic physiology, it was also very helpful to surgeons. Surgery in that day was evolving because it was using more empiric methods, more anatomical basis, and particularly they were dealing with a new phenomenon in the 16th century, and that was they dealt with battles and war. Surgeons were always familiar with spear wounds and sword cuts, but now they were dealing with handheld musket and ballistic wounds. And the anatomy was very helpful. There's one story in O'Malley about how to amputate at the elbow, and if you didn't understand that the olecranon protruded past the joint, you would make a mess of it. And so, yes, anatomy was very important for helping the surgeons. And one of the important surgeons then was Ambrose Paré, of course, the French surgeon. And he and Vesalius knew each other and were polite and friendly, but they were on opposite sides of the military field. But they were often consulted on the same injuries. So yes, I think anatomy was very important in the evolving practice of surgery.
Okay. And who is the Vesalius of today?
I don't know. I think like E.O. Wilson or people who, and medically, I don't really know who I would. I guess you'd have to take a look at some of the Nobel laureates of medicine, and if I would say anybody, I guess I would say Linus Pauling. He got 2 Nobel Prizes, one for peace by rowing out in the San Francisco Bay or someplace, and the other for I think in chemistry and medicine. He almost got a 3rd. He came very close to getting a 3rd. I think it was Max Perutz got it for the hemoglobin. He was very close to getting it for hemoglobin. So I guess I would say Linus Pauling.
Mm-hmm. And Peter Schneider says there's a quotation over the entrance to the Padua Anatomy Theater that says, "Here death rejoices to serve the living." Do you know if that came before Vesalius or after?
I'd have to look. If that person wants to email me, I'll get back to you. It seems familiar from O'Malley's book. So I have a feeling it was there when Vesalius was there. But I'd be happy to get back to that person if you want to email me, rmratzan@gmail.com.
Sure.
It sounds familiar.
Okay. And let's see, we've got, were the illustrations from Vesalius used in other books?
Yes. Well, they were used legitimately and illegitimately. They're used legitimately there was a 2nd edition in 1555, which used many of the same wood blocks. And I would encourage people to try and look at, there are essays that are not in that book, the 3 Vesalian essays. There are essays on the wood blocks in the medical literature and PubMed, and I can send somebody, if anyone, you should really read about how those wood blocks were lost for hundreds of years. And then in 1931, 32, Samuel Lambert at the New York Academy of Medicine was giving a talk, and a consultant to the library in the audience, Macau, reminded him, or told him, that the biographer of Vesalius, Moritz Roth, ROTH, who was a German pathologist, and, by the way, the eponymous founder or discoverer of Roth spots. He wrote a huge biography of Vesalius. Roth had published a paper saying those blocks were still around. And so Lambert wrote a letter to the University of Munich, and they found in a box up in the attic. It's like Antique Roadshow. They found in a box in the attic all these blocks. And with Willy Wiegand, who was a printer at the Bremen Press in Munich, and Samuel Lambert, they printed this 1934 reproduction of just the illustrations. And actually, our host, Dr. McGee, has a copy of this book. It was printed by the New York Academy of Medicine. So the illustrations were in 1543, 1555. There was a very smaller format in 1562. And then there were other editions unauthorized in the 18th century. And then, as I said, the original blocks were used to reproduce the illustrations in the 1934 edition of the Fabrica. They were used illegitimately in lots of plagiarized books.
Okay. What was medical education like in Vesalius's time? Were there apprenticeships? Was it mostly classroom? How variable was education? Were doctors anyone who declared themselves a doctor, or was there some sort of formal process?
It was really quite regimented. There were, the guild structure was barber surgeons at the bottom, then surgery next, and above surgery were physicians. Above them were academic physicians, and above them were the teachers and professors, the highest ranking. But the medical school was very regimented. It was a 36-month or 4-year course. I misspoke in the lecture. He was at Paris for 3 years. He had to leave because of the war. He did his 4th year at Louvain, but they had a prescribed course for the first. It started October 18th, which was the day of St. Luke, who was a patron saint of physicians, and it went from November, when classes started, to June for 4 years, and they alternated physiology, without going over the actual curriculum, pharmacology. And at the end of 4 years, they then had oral exams. They had to have a baccalaureate in arts even to get into medical school. At the end of the 4 years of medical school, they had oral exams. They had to defend theses, which were really just some topic that they picked in pharmacology or hygiene. And then if they passed all that, they became a Bachelor of Medicine. They then had to spend a year working with a famous physician, in quotation marks, and visit the sick. And at the end of that, they became a Doctor of Medicine. And then if they were hired by a medical school and passed the entrance exam to teach there, they became a licentiate.
Wow. So that is pretty intense. Well, we have time for one more question. And I think while you're answering it, I'm going to share the screen with information about your book.
Okay. Thank you.
So let me see if I can do that.
Well, while Dale's bringing it up, just let me say that the only reason I'm putting this, made the screen up, is that it's my first book. It turns out that authors have no control over the retail price of a book. And since it's a print-on-demand book from a nonprofit press, neither the University of California nor I get a penny if we sell one copy or 14 million. Barnes and Noble and Amazon get to set the price of the book. And because it's expensive to print one copy, because it's high quality paper and color art, they set the price at $105, which is outrageous. So if you order it from University of California, it's $65, which is still.
All right. So Lynn Eckert asks, what do you think of the national anatomical exhibits that have been popular several years ago, presented in cities around the country, depicting anatomical specimens and positions such as playing baseball or dancing, et cetera?
Right. Yeah, I personally, even more than the history of medicine or Ekphrastic, I spend my life in the world of ethics. And I had a lot of problems. I went to see that exhibit. A friend of mine who has long since died bought me a copy. And although they were fascinating, there were several ethical problems with that for me. One is the poses were, one could make a strong argument that they were disrespectful in trying to not just portray anatomy, but to portray dead bodies doing humorous, not always humorous, but mundane things. And I have a certain respect for the dead, which is irrevocably firm. The second ethical problem is there was a lot of talk about whether or not those bodies were legitimately, consensually donated and provided, or whether they were criminals or trafficked bodies. That would clearly make it no better than Nazi experiments, or the Pernkopf Atlas. I think it's Pernkopf. But even forgetting that, I just had a problem with what I thought was at times, frivolous display of dead bodies.
Okay. Well, I think we've run the run here, and I just thank you so much for this presentation. It was so informative, well received, a lot of very good comments in our chat and question and answer area. And this will be available on the Boston Medical Library YouTube channel, so that if you want to view parts of it again or recommend it to a friend, we certainly encourage you to do that. But for now, I thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Ratzan, and we bid everyone a good evening.